I want to welcome you all to our spring conference. We do 2 annual conferences at the Loyola Family Business Center. The one that we are doing today is focused on business operations. The one we do in the fall is focused on family strategy, or family upskills, if you will, or upskilling, to use the verbiage of the day. I'm Ann Smart. For those of you whom I haven't met, I'm the director of the Loyola Family Business Center, and I'm really, really pleased to be with you today. What we are all about at the Family Business Center is sharing information and knowledge and experience and processes that have worked for other family businesses. We do that by offering a confidential forum and an environment that is where there's no solicitation. So those of you who haven't maybe joined us before will maybe not know that one of the things that we really ask and require of everybody participating is that whatever you hear here today, especially in the breakout rooms, you're going to hold. This is the way that we can share freely with one another and learn from one another. The other thing that I want to just sort of set the table about is we have this fabulous expert with us today, and we're really privileged to have him with us. But I also just want to remind you that you too are experts. And I always think that when we bring people together, it's sort of like bringing the brain trust together. You have as much to teach as you have to learn. And so when we move to our breakout sessions after our keynote, we're really going to encourage you to share with one another based on a group of questions that we have set out to sort of frame the discussion. We are going to be given, you all have, I should say, the great opportunity to be facilitated in your rooms, your breakout rooms, by these really, really talented students that work with me and work with us in the Family Business Center. They're going to facilitate the group roundtable questions in the breakout sessions. They are Anna Pertan. She is actually a graduate of Loyola's Quinlan School of Business, and she is rolling right into the one-year MBA program. So welcome, Anna. And Bryn Reamer, who is a rising junior at Quinlan and absolutely brilliant. We're happy to have her with us. And then Gianni Cooley, who is also a recent graduate and a soon-to-be law school student. We hope at Loyola, fingers crossed. So that's who sort of our talent pool is today, that is going to help move us through the day and help us make sure that we have really engaging and interesting conversations in our breakout room. At this point, I just want to share quickly the agenda so that you have an idea of our time today. I always think it's really helpful to know, like, well, how long am I going to have to sit on this Zoom? Hopefully it won't feel like that. Hopefully it'll feel like, oh, that time just flew right by. We're going to start with this sort of opening and housekeeping, and then we've got a little more than an hour with Jude, who's going to give us, his overview of strategic planning for the family business, especially that focused on execution. He has so much to share. We probably could do a whole day with him, and maybe someday we will be able to do that again. In 2017, Jude came to us and did one of our in-person conferences, and it was one of the highest rated conferences we've had. When we were thinking about, well, essentially, how are we going to put this program together? What do people need to know? What kept coming up from my advisory board, actually the programming committee, is people need to know what is next. Everybody has been so focused on, just making sure the trains run on time, take care of your people, make sure things are going according as well as can be expected during the pandemic. But now there's this brief moment to pause. And what we thought is that Jude would be the perfect person to orient us about, let's pause and think how we go forward, probably in a different way than we have in the past. And he's going to share some of that information with us. After we listen to him, you're going to have a little bit of time to answer or to ask some really, pertinent questions. We're going to try to limit those because you're going to also have an opportunity to talk to Jude after we come back from the breakout sessions. So I'll take a couple of questions, I'll monitor the chat and so on as he speaks, and then we'll move into our breakout session around 10 o'clock. At that moment, just so you know, you'll have time to do a bio break or whatever, and then we'll resume our breakout rooms at 10:10. After that, we'll have a really, hopefully, great discussion. We have 4 breakout rooms today, so you've got about 9 or 10 people in each room. And then you'll have a great conversation. We'll come back about 11:45. I'm going to check in and make sure that, if the conversation is robust and you want to keep talking, I don't want to derail that, but I'm just going to take a temperature check and see how you guys are doing. And then we'll come back to the main room and report back on what we found, because we'd love to share what everybody learns. So that's our day, and we're really happy to have you with us. So I would like to introduce our wonderful keynote special guest, Jude Rake. Jude is the founding principal of JDR Growth Partners. This is a consulting firm that he established that helps business owners, boards, chief executives, and leadership teams achieve really excellent results and sustainable growth. He's very focused on execution and sustainable growth. He's, a former CEO, a former C-suite executive, and has worked with a number of family-owned businesses in that role, as well as sitting on their boards. So we are delighted to have Jude join us today. I am going to stop share now and ask Jude to share his screen. Welcome, Jude.
Hi, everybody. I would also add to that I'm honored to be on the board of directors of the Wall Family Enterprise. So it's nice to see all my friends. Okay, so I'm going to share screen, and hopefully you are about to see that.
Does everyone see it? Thumbs up? Okay.
Good. All right, I'm going to go into presentation mode. Thanks for that gracious introduction, Ann. Ann and I were talking last month about the unprecedented amount of ambiguity and uncertainty that leaders have had to navigate over the past 14 months or so. And it reminded me that I said, I think I wrote about this about 14 months ago. I think it was last April of 2020. And I pulled up the article. It was kind of interesting. I thought the first paragraph actually was a good way to set the table for what we're going to talk about today. And what I wrote was, leadership requires balance and dexterity and the ability to cut through the noise to focus on the signals that matter most. When a crisis hits, it's important to manage urgent challenges by embracing ambiguity with a steady hand, while also leading your team in search of transformational opportunities created by the crisis. Leaders must be ambidextrous as they navigate the tension between managing and leading. Sometimes this means resisting the inertial pull of crisis management that can make leaders feel productive, but also steal too much energy from strategic thinking, analysis, planning, and action. The heavy lifting required to survive a crisis such as COVID-19 can sap an organization, leaving little attention and energy for strategy. Yet strategy matters more now than ever. So let's jump in and talk about strategy a little bit. That was actually from the article that I was just referencing. So Webster defines strategy as a plan of action or policy designed to achieve a major or overall aim. And I actually like this definition. It's interesting when you ask a room full of people to write down a definition of strategy, you get all kinds of answers. It's kind of like asking them about leadership. But my definition is an approach to achieving objectives and goals by leveraging strengths to overcome obstacles to growth. And that's pretty much what we're going to talk about this morning, about how to do that. Now, there's a good reason why most people hate this topic. I grew up working in big companies like Pepsi and Clorox, and really well-run companies. And I really enjoyed it and got a lot of great training. But usually when the strategic planning part of the year came around, we liked developing business plans, but strategic plans often felt like a waste of time. Quite frankly, they were often financial scenario planning exercises led by the CFO, or maybe they involved a retreat or a strategic planning offsite, but they were often treated as one-time events. They drain resources away from running the business. It's hard to do well. They can be obsolete before finished, given how fast things change. And they often seem unnecessary to many successful leaders. I like this quote from Herb Kelleher: "We have a strategic plan. It's called doing things." So, when and I think oftentimes it leads to bad strategies. many of the strategic plans I've seen over the years really are not that focused, and they're not that choiceful, and they end up spreading resources like peanut butter to placate either internal or external constituencies. And the reality is a strategic plan is not very good if it's not making some people unhappy, because there needs to be a focus to it where resources are moved from lower value work to higher value work. The other problem with many strategic plans is they're done in silos. So they're disconnected and they don't achieve fidelity of implementation because they don't get the synergies working cross-functionally. What this leads to is disengagement. Franklin Covey did a study a couple years ago of over 90,000 people who worked at different companies. And the qualifier for the study was that the company had to claim that they had a strategic plan. This was a global study. And of everyone interviewed, now remember, every one of these companies claimed to have a strategic plan. Only 15% of the people could accurately name one of the top 3 goals in the company's strategic plan. Of that 15%, only 51% said they were truly committed to achieving the goal. And only 34% said they meet at least monthly with their boss to track their progress against the goal. So this is what this leads to. And when I first got my first CEO job, and I would be walking around the plant or the company out and about or out in the field with customers, I saw this sometimes, and I would get really frustrated because I grew up working on farms and was taught by my mom, who worked in a factory, that you always work hard and do your best. And I couldn't understand why people wouldn't care more about the company. But after a while, I realized that this is really our job, and maybe it's not so much them, but that the leaders, that we weren't doing our job in getting them more connected to where we wanted to go and why, and what it was going to take to win. And I like this from Patrick Lencioni from his book, 3 Signs of a Miserable Job, when he talks about why do people disengage? Well, it's 3 things he talks about: anonymity, irrelevance, and immeasurable. I really do believe most people come into a company really fired up to make a difference, and they're inspired to make a name for themselves in their job and contribute. But over time, too often, we don't tap into that well enough. And the reality is the data is pretty stark on this, that most supervisors in companies are really not that good at supervising and leading their people. And here's some data. This starts at the top of the company at the highest level managers. And the x-axis is the top, where they stack up in the top 10%, next 25, next 30, next 25, next 10 on their effectiveness. So think of this as a performance rating. And this kind of goes under the heading of crap flows downhill. And then when you take that and you look at beyond effectiveness, and you look at engagement, it goes beyond the next level of leadership. It actually cascades down into the company. So the reality is we have a lot of supervisors that need help in engaging the workforce in what the company needs to do to win. Here's just a little bit more data that was done by Mental Health America. It was a workplace health survey, and they had 3 questions. They wanted people to rate. My company appropriately deals with coworkers who are not doing his or her job. Only 17% said always or often. Another one was, if things get hard, my supervisor will support me. Only 36% said always or often. And then all people are held accountable for their work, regardless of their position in the company. Only 28% said always or often. And then in another survey that was done by American Workplace, actually it was done by Gallup of the American Workplace, 8 in 10 workers believe their boss lacks vision or clear communication. 6 of 10 workers would choose a new boss over a pay raise. And 3 of 4 workers say their supervisor is the most stressful part of their job. And then a little bit more data here for you, and I think this is common sense to most. People in workplaces with good management relations are significantly more satisfied. I'd like to see that measure on engagement, but I'll take satisfaction. And it's pretty obvious that makes a difference. And then finally, there's quite a bit of data out there that a more engaged workforce leads to more profitability, more customer satisfaction, more productivity, and more quality and higher quality. So that leads us to, so how do we do this strategy thing? Well, the first thing is recognizing that that's an issue, that we can't just go into an ivory tower and come up with a strategy like a lot of consulting firms like to do. Some focus on strategy, some focus on execution, and we really believe that you've got to make sure we've got that link with talent and culture. And culture has become a much hotter topic over the last few years. But I want to talk some more about that. So I came up with these 9 principles. We talked about them back in 2017 when we got together around servant leadership and bridging strategy into exceptional execution. I even wrote a book about it. I'm not going to go through all that today. We don't have time. I am going to focus on principles 3 and 4 quite a bit. And they're really about being crystal clear about how we're going to win in the market. So who are we? What do we believe? What sets us apart? Really important question. How can we leverage our strengths? Where are we going? What does success look like? What are the main obstacles to success? Let's not be Pollyannish. What's the plan to get there? And this is a really important one. Can everybody in the company answer the question, how does my work connect to the plan and help us win? We may never get to the point where everyone can answer that well, but that should be the beacon. That's what we're really striving for. So good strategies provide guidance and drive tough choices and focus and accountability deeper into the organization, focusing resources where they create the most synergy and economic value. So rather than having people running down a lot of different paths, disjointed, we're clear about where we're going to focus to win. And then we're operating more like a rowing crew synergistically and in harmony to get there. So what does success look like? Well, first and foremost, and I've underlined, this is the only one I underlined because it's really important. When I start working with a family enterprise, the first question I ask is, do you have a shareholder's vision? Because it really sets the table. And it's really important that whatever we come up with is aligned with that vision and the values of the family and the shareholders. It also should leverage the organization's strengths to deliver market meaningful uniqueness, because uniqueness has been proven time and again to be the #1 predictor of end market success. It should be developed collaboratively to cultivate a shared vision and purpose-driven strategy. Based on honest assessments of the organization and the market, we're going to talk more about that in a minute. Connected and integrated cross-functionally, as I said earlier. It's got to be communicated relentlessly and with authenticity. I think we've all been a part of organizations at some point where they rolled out a new strategic plan. There was one communication meeting, and then that was it. And everybody went back to work and pretty much continued doing what they were doing before. Might have been motivational, but there wasn't a lot of follow-up. It's got to be a provocative springboard for bigger business building ideas. It should be cascaded down to focus goals and performance metrics that fuel accountability. I'm actually going to show you a few tools that you could use to do that. Maybe you're already doing that yourself. It should drive the cultural transformation and talent growth needed to achieve success. So we can't just have a plan. We've got to execute it with the right people in the right places doing the right things. And then finally, and this is important, it's got to be ingrained into the fabric of the organization as an ongoing core business practice. We do not believe that strategic planning should be a one and done event or something that's done annually. It actually, we believe, should be built into strategic, operational, executional activity that's ongoing. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a few minutes. So this is the overarching objective we always start with. Preserve and leverage what has made us successful over the years. We want to be respectful of that while driving the change needed to help us achieve our full potential. That brings me to that third principle I was referencing. So organizations inherently complicate things. Focus your organization on strategic priorities, simplify operations, and accelerate progress. I have yet to be involved with a company, either in my career or over the last 7 years consulting with them, that wasn't overly complicated, that didn't have too many SKUs, and have a lot of complexity that was unnecessary in their system. And I really do believe that it's leadership's responsibility to constantly be engaging people in how they minimize that complexity and move lower value work to higher value work. And this planning process is geared toward engaging them in doing that, not telling them. So I came up with this process about 25 years ago, actually, when I was working at SC Johnson. And I had grown kind of frustrated because while at other companies like Pepsi and Clark's, I had worked with quite a few big consulting firms, McKinsey, BCG, Bain, and really smart people doing terrific work. But one of the frustrations I had was the work was often disconnected with the front lines of the company and the reality of the business. And having grown up working in factories in a blue collar world, I really felt that that was important. What I'm about to share with you requires giving some credit, because I've had some great bosses over the years, and also really was fortunate to work with Stephen Covey, Jim Collins, Patrick Lencioni. And then Joe Maloff came into SCJ from Procter & Gamble and taught me the OGSM method, objectives, goals, strategies, and measures that I'm going to share with you in a few minutes. So I really borrowed a lot of what I'm going to share with you right now and created my own blueprint for doing this, but I owe them quite a bit. So here's what we do. First, we kind of go in and do a deep dive and start analyzing the business, but then we work with the leadership team to make sure we've defined our core values. Most people have those, but we still take a relook at those and make sure the team's aligned on them. And most often we find that they want to tweak them a little bit. We do a SWOT. Everybody's done a SWOT. And then we make sure we are aligned on a purpose for the organization. What's the customer promise? And then what are the reasons to believe that promise? And then we do a root cause analysis, which everybody likes to do because we all like to complain and come up with plans to fix things. And I'm going to talk about each of these briefly in a minute, but this is our roadmap. Then we step back and assess the situation we're confronted with and draw out any strategic implications. And then once we've done that, we talk about what do we want to be when we grow up? What do we want to be in 10 years? We try to pick a horizon that's a little farther out than the plan. So the plan is going to be 3 to 5 years. We want to look even further out to see what we're shooting for. And once we've defined that, now we're ready to actually do some strategic planning and develop objectives, goals, strategies, and measures. Once that's drafted, we go back and gut check it against the root cause analysis to see if we've missed anything and we were maybe being Pollyannish to any obstacles in our way. And now this is the hard part. Most people stop with the plan and go execute it. And we actually walk a little bit into execution before finalizing it, because we find that these strategic plans are often too ambitious and have not focused quite enough. Our eyes are bigger than our stomach. So we step back and say, if this is where we're headed and how we're going to get there, what are the capabilities we're going to need and what actions do we recommend to take to improve our capabilities? And we lay out a 3-year action plan because we want to make sure that all those objectives, how many we have, usually there's 4 or 5, are connected cross-functionally and they're paced and sequenced properly, because we can't do everything that we've laid out in the plan right out of the blocks, or we're going to stumble all over ourselves. Now, what a lot of companies do is they go do a 3-day offsite, they do a root cause analysis, and they develop that 3-year action plan, and they call that a strategic plan. But we subscribe to Dwight Eisenhower's saying that plans are nothing. It's really about the planning that's important. And everything you see up above that red line is important. It's important because teams need to argue and they need to debate a lot more than they do in a 3-day offsite. And they need to do it intermittently and go back and forth from work sessions and let this thing percolate, because we're planting seeds and fertilizing them and watering them. and we need some constructive contention. So one really nice byproduct of this process I'm going to go over with you is it elevates the performance of the leadership team, because I have yet to work with a leadership team, even the best ones that I've led, that couldn't benefit from more constructive contention, either because they don't have enough debate and open and honest dialogue, or when they do, it's not healthy. So a big part of this process is elevating the amount of constructive contention on the team. There are other variables you can see around this chain link that we work on. We don't have time today to talk about those, but as we go through this planning process, we double click on all of those 10 variables that help us elevate the performance of the team. Now, when we get started in this, I often use this visual, and I ask the leaders in the room, most of them are functional leaders, maybe R&D, marketing, sales. And we talk about the fact that in their day-to-day work, they're often down amongst the trees. And even CEOs are down amongst the trees quite a bit, hopefully. But in this process, we're trying to get them to elevate and see a bigger picture. And usually by the second or third work session, we've got the entire team looking at the business more like an owner would look at the business. And this is a really critical part of the process, because in the beginning, most of the leaders have parochial interests, and we're trying to get them on the same page with the CEO and the ownership as we start developing the plan and the path forward to winning. The other thing that's really critical and very unique about this process is we get other people involved. I love this saying from Wilson: "You teach me, I forget. You show me, I remember. You involve me, I understand." And I'll even add, and I contribute more. Most strategic planning processes are done largely in ivory towers with executives. What we do, and this is what makes it time consuming, but in the long run, it actually saves you time, is we actually involve difference makers. And maybe even more than the difference makers. And I define difference makers as people who have performed well, not just high potential, but in the 9 box, they're performing well and they have high potential. And we start with the list, and we make sure all of those people are engaged at some point along the process. And this becomes iterative, where the core leadership team is going off and orchestrating some of the work, and we're coming back together and processing it. This builds excitement in the organization. And more importantly, we always learn a lot that the leadership team didn't know. People love being asked to be engaged, and it's an integral part of this process. So the timeline, which I don't expect you to process all this, but I did want to just show it to you because it does take time. It's typically takes about 6 months, and we do monthly work sessions where we come together and we debate a lot of the flow chart that I just showed you a couple minutes ago, and then they go off and do work. And I find it's really helpful for teams to spend a day working on this and then spend a month back at their day job and then come back together, and they're starting to see things a little differently. Now, for really super action-oriented leaders like I was, they look at this and say, "Oh my God, this is crazy. We shouldn't do this much. We already know what to do. Let's just lay it out and go do it." Usually about the third work session, those people will turn to me and go, "Now I see why we're doing this," because they start to see the engagement rising and the learning rising from involving those difference makers in the process. So let's talk about it a little bit more. I think everybody on this call has probably done more than their fair of SWOTs. I just wanted to give you 2 tools, because I often find that most of the SWOTs that I've seen are actually flawed, quite flawed. Because they mix up strengths and opportunities, and they mix up weaknesses and threats. Everybody knows that strengths and opportunities are helpful and weaknesses and threats are harmful. But most people don't differentiate between those. Weaknesses and strengths are internally or originated, and opportunities and threats are external. I actually borrowed this from a colleague. This one I actually created. This helps people think about it deeper. So strengths are good now. You want to maintain, you want to build, and you want to leverage them. Weaknesses are bad now. You want to remedy and stop. Threats are bad future, counter, crush, avoid. and opportunities are good future. Prioritize, invest, accelerate, optimize. And then what we do after we've done this is we take, and again, we're engaging other people beyond the leadership team in that assessment. Then we take the strengths and the opportunities, and now we start talking about purpose, because we want a purpose-driven strategy and promise, and also the reasons to believe that promise. This is a really important step in the process. I love this quote by Peter Drucker. Profit is not the purpose of a business, but rather the test of its validity. It's basically the scoreboard. And I put this in here because I often hear senior teams and leadership teams and executive committees say, well, our people are really clear about our purpose, and the data would not confirm that. You can see most senior people feel like they are able to act out their personal purpose in their work, but the reality is most of the frontline workers would not agree with that. So how do you define purpose? Well, it should be your company's reason for being. It reflects your idealistic motivations for doing your work, captures the soul of the organization, should not be confused with goals or strategies. And while you can achieve goals, a purpose is never fully fulfilled. It's like that beacon on the horizon. And I always encourage teams to keep asking why you do what you do to help you ladder up to a higher level purpose. It's tough because if you keep laddering up, you'll get to something too generic or general that could be just about any company. And then once we've defined that, actually, here's one of my favorite examples. I love when Lego came up with this: inspire and develop the builders of tomorrow. It's a great one. I can get excited about getting up and going to work at a company that wants to do that. And then once we define the purpose, and I've got an example here of customer promise and reasons to believe. This is from one of my clients that gave me permission to share this. Their purpose was we enhance people's lives by making buildings better. Their customer promise, we solve complex design and building challenges that perplex others. And then I won't drag you through the reasons to believe, but those reasons to believe should be closely correlated with your strengths in the SWOT. And for any marketers on the call, this looks a little bit like a marketing brief. So this whole piece should connect very closely with any marketing you're doing for the company. So then we step back and say, okay, let's take the weaknesses and the threats, because we're going to build the plan on the back of the strengths and the opportunities, but we don't want to be Pollyannish to our weaknesses and threats and our obstacles to growth. And we do a root cause analysis. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I think everybody knows what a root cause analysis is. But I do like this quote from Richard Rummelt, who wrote Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. If you fail to identify and analyze the obstacles, you don't have a strategy. Instead, you have either a stretch goal, a budget, or a list of things you wish would happen. And that's often what I see in strategies. So we're going to put that aside and come back to it later and do a gut check against the root cause analysis once we've got the plan drafted. So now we're into the situation review, strategic implications, and envisioned future. And what we want to come up with here, well, I'll save that thought for a couple minutes later. So here, when I say situation review, we want to analyze and describe the current situation, use facts, trends, and this 4-quadrant analysis I'm going to share with you in a second to ensure objectivity. And then we step back and say, based on the situation, what does the team recommend we do to improve or capitalize on the opportunities and solve obstacles to growth, and leverage the strengths to overcome the biggest obstacles? And then finally, based on the strategic implications, craft the minimal number of objectives needed to achieve the vision. And I'll talk about what objectives are in a minute. And then define goals, strategies, and KPIs or measures for each of those objectives. Before we do that, though, we want to make sure we're being market-driven in the work. And this is a really important step in the process because I find that most companies are not as market-connected as they think they are. I'm often surprised how few executives spend time in the field with customers, or maybe even more importantly, out with consumers or end users of their products and services. So we use this 4-quadrant analysis to ground the team. I don't care if you work in IT or HR or operations or marketing or sales. If you're a leader of a company, these are important questions that need to be answered. So we start with the market lens. Are we competing in profitable markets that offer growth over time? Some of the questions, I'm just going to give you a few just to give you a sampling that we ask are, do we fully understand our current or potential end users and customers' pain points, as well as their likes and dislikes about the way we and our competitors serve them? What and where are the biggest sources of profitable growth in our current markets? Should we focus on growing share in our current markets, growing the size of our current markets with new benefits or value to our end users, extending into adjacent markets, or geographic expansion? Too often, I see companies trying to do all those and diluting their resources. Can we focus on first things first to get momentum and then sequence our efforts? Are we fully aware of future trends that could disrupt our current markets or provide an opening for us to enter adjacent markets successfully? And then the last one, are we targeting our prime consumers or end users and potential consumers with enough of the right messaging to fuel awareness of our points of difference and build our brand? So those are just some of the examples we asked there in the market lens portion of the analysis. Then we get into competitive lens and what does it take to win in these markets? So are we being willfully blind to a looming competitive or industry threat? We spend some time on that. Are we investing enough in our strengths to ensure they remain competitive advantages long-term? Are we getting enough real-time market and customer insight to win? Do we know our customers, shoppers, or end users better than anyone else? As companies transform digitally, are we at least keeping up with omni-channel methods to reach our consumers more efficiently? And then the last one, are we keeping pace with technological transformations, which are happening at an increasing pace? So one of the tools we use to get at these two, the market lens and the competitive lens, relates to this fourth principle. Champion the people who purchase and use your products and services. Otherwise, corporate inertia will steal too much energy inwardly toward lower value work. This is what we use as a mechanism. This never sees the light of day. It's just used to get the team arguing and debating and aligning on how we're going to win. So we go through a process where we ask, who are our most important end users? Usually there's a lack of alignment there. So we do a bullseye. So who are the most important, next most important? We do that with end users or consumers, and we do it with customers. Then we assess how we perform on what they need or their need gaps potentially, and then our competition. And then we step back and we craft a strategy canvas with those needs along the x-axis, and then just how we rate versus our competition. And I know this is a messy chart. We don't really have to process this too much, but just the construction, back to Eisenhower's point, it's about the planning, not the plan. The construction of this alone, and I've redacted who the companies are there on the right, drives a lot of healthy debate on the team about how we're performing in the market, because we want our strategy to be market driven. And then once we've done that, now we want to get people to open their minds and really think about the future. So what's coming our way that could cause us to potentially change that strategy canvas? There's plenty of examples that we talk about where people have been disrupted. You can all think of them yourself as consumers, or maybe even in your business. And a big part of this is anticipating what's next. So, whether it's autonomous vehicles or potentially, what's happening in the legal with AI in the legal profession, or robotic surgeries. There's a lot of technological changes happening right now that we want people to think about. And then I've got a couple of videos. If you're interested, you may want to Google "humans need not apply." It's actually a few years old, but believe it or not, it really is a good way to get people to think about the future and how technology could change work. I don't agree with all of it, but it's a great way to open people's minds to this part of the process. And then once we've got them thinking about what's coming our way and what changes might be happening, then we step back and say, okay, given that future and the changes, what do we think we should change about our strategy canvas? What should we create? Which factors should be created that the industry has never offered? What should we raise above the industry standard? What should we reduce below the industry standard, and what should we eliminate? And this is borrowed from Blue Ocean Strategy, if you've read that book. And then this leads to a future strategy canvas that the teams create. And we do get others involved in this beyond the leadership team. So once we've done that, now we're starting to really think strategically. We want to talk about, can our team actually deliver where we're headed? So some of the questions we ask here is our supply chain optimized to exceed customer expectations at the lowest cost? Do we have the competencies needed to win organically, or do we need to acquire a company or partner with someone to augment our strengths and weaknesses? Are we managing, developing, and allocating our talent well? Are we clear with the organization regarding priorities and resource allocation, or do we leave it to them to figure it out? Then we come to the most important piece is, are we going to create economic value to put food on the table? What is needed in that regard? How does our financial performance compare to our competitors? Stepping back and analyzing our P&L and balance sheet, where are the biggest pain, pivot, or leverage points where improvement would create the most economic value? What are the biggest opportunities where breakthrough innovation supported by memorable and persuasive marketing will drive the most profitable growth? Can we generate returns for our shareholders that exceed the cost of capital and satisfy their financial goals better than alternative investments? So once we've done that, we've got people kind of grounded in the market, thinking about the future, is a good time to envision the future. When I talk about that, I'm talking about connecting to the previously defined purpose, embracing expected changes, defining an ambitious and stretch goal, paint a vibrant description of what it will be like to achieve the goal. Passion, emotion, and conviction are essential. There should be a gulp factor, and it should inspire disruptive thinking. You want to make sure we're leveraging our core values and our strengths, and it should preserve the core of who we are and why we got here, but also stimulate progress. Some perspectives to consider as we're crafting this envisioned future, I've listed here. I'm not going to read through all of them. You can read them faster than I can say them. But we want to look at everything from the marketplace to our owners and the functions within our company. I'm going to show you an example. When I was CEO for Recycled Paper Greetings, this was what we came up with. Our vision was the funniest, freshest, and greenest greeting cards on earth. And our purpose was to make people smile and laugh while sustaining our earth one smile at a time. We were the only cards that were printed at the time on recycled paper, believe it or not. And then we defined our envisioned future. I won't go through all these, but I want to point out there was triple market share, which was the big BHAG, right? But then there was our shelf section in the store as a destination where people come for a good laugh. We are the most agile and nimble greeting card company, and we are the most knowledgeable and fact-based when it comes to the humor segment. So I won't go through the rest of them, but this statement then was taken to the key objectives that were going to be in the strategic plan, and to some extent the functions, and it led to all kinds of strategic actions like, well, if we're going to be in humor's topical. If we're going to own that, we need to be fast to market. So it led to an entirely new ERP system. We took our idea to shelf from 17 weeks to 3 weeks. And then it led to each of these important aspects of the business defining that envisioned future even more specifically before the strategic plan was developed. And you can imagine then how these statements turned into very focused objectives from which we could develop the goals, the strategies, and the measures. And then one of the things I always encourage my clients to do is to make a statement to the people in the company about cultural transformation and talk about what is it that we want to preserve that's so good about us, but what do we want to change going forward that's not so good, that we know we need to improve on? And then constantly catching people doing something well when they're exhibiting those behaviors, featuring them in town hall meetings, and I'll talk about communication in a minute. Now we're finally ready to do strategic planning because we've got our brains where we need them. And this is what I mean by the planning is just as important as the plan. Frankly, I've seen mediocre plans lead to great results and great plans lead to bad results. And it all hinged on how well the team did the planning work and the execution. And the execution hinges heavily on how well they've done this work up to now. So when I say objectives, goals, strategies, and measures, it often looks something like this. So what is an objective? It's where we are going qualitatively. It makes the vision more specific. While the Envisioned Future looks out over the next 5 to 10 years, the objectives detail what must happen over the next 1 to 3 years to make the Envisioned Future a reality. A good way to test if you have landed on an objective is to keep asking why. The answer will often ladder you to a more meaningful objective. If it describes how you will achieve the Envisioned Future, it belongs in the strategy portion of the strategic plan. Next up is goals, where we are going quantitatively. Most goals begin with an active verb such as increase or decrease and define the amount of improvement required. For example, a company with an objective of becoming a top-rated employer, goals might include increasing employee satisfaction, increasing employee trust of leadership, decreasing employee turnover, all by a specified amount. Now, they can be specified more in the measures section. And again, if it describes how you're going to do it, it's not a goal. Now, let's talk about strategies. These are the heart and soul of a strategic plan, the roadmap taking you from vision, objectives, and goals to the reality you desire. For example, a strategy to accomplish the goal of increasing employee satisfaction or engagement would be a better one, might be to implement more flexible work programs. And then I think everybody's familiar with measures and KPIs. This is just an example. Medco is not a real company, but it kind of just shows you how this can all be laid out. Typically, companies have 4 to 5 objectives, and we want to make sure that they're connected cross-functionally, but then you lay out goals, strategies, measures, and then we get into the initiatives you're going to need to pursue to get there, who owns it, priority, status, timing. All right, so that's usually where a lot of people stop. And they say, okay, we got a plan, we communicate it, we go. But I actually find it helps to walk into execution a little bit before we start communicating the plan, because it usually leads to some changes. And it usually causes us to focus the plan a little more and be more choiceful. So I mentioned this before. We go into capabilities assessment and recommended actions and 3-year action plan. The reason we do that is I love this study that was done by Mankins and Steele. And they looked at why strategic plans fall short. And I'm getting close here toward the end. So this is just going to be a few more slides. So hang with me here. They found that you're not going to see anything on this list that says bad strategy. They found priorities and alignment and resource allocation to be a big problem. Communication, roles, responsibilities, and accountability being unclear. Org structure and capabilities not being what they need to be, and cultural problems. And I put all this under the banner of leadership. You could also say a lot of that's about execution. So it's very important now that we've engaged at least a broad section of the company, at least the difference makers in the development of this plan, so that hopefully we've identified some of these problems that might happen and we've addressed them in the plan, not later. Of course, we'll have to pivot and adapt as we go and course correct, but we want to make sure we've thought about that as much as possible up front. So when we go to deploy the plan, we focus on 4 pillars. Have we set our Cascading Accountability. So we walk through this a little bit. I'm going to pause for a second because I just got a notice that my internet is unstable. Can you guys hearing me okay?
I can hear you now, Jude. You went out for a minute.
Okay. Did you capture this chart, this slide? Did you hear this piece? Okay.
But you might say this slide one more time.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So that previous chart is why we think it's important to bridge into execution by focusing on these 4 pillars. Do we have our priorities straight, and are we allocating resources accordingly? Have we structured the organization? Do we have the capabilities to deliver the plan? Are we going to communicate it properly? And are we cascading it in a way that's going to drive accountable execution? So then that takes us to a model that I learned years ago at the Center for Creative Leadership, which I think is really valuable. We use this with our teams. It's called DAC. It's direction. Some of you have probably seen it. It's all about direction, alignment, and commitment, making sure we've got everybody aligned and committed on we've defined the direction, we've got the plan. And right where those 3 intersect is leadership, and I would also add trust. That's when we're starting to really build trust as we execute the plan. So what we do is we have a good discussion around priorities. There are going to be things going on in the company that the leadership team is not engaged in, but I encourage every team to have a priority list that is the center of gravity. It's the thrust of the plan and the projects, and they're actually hands-on managing it on a month-by-month basis. So we've moved from planning to execution. They're still getting together monthly for a day. I have some leaders say, we don't have time to do that. Well, what's funny is when we start moving into execution and that day becomes so productive that it actually starts freeing up time. It starts reducing meetings, and it ends up giving back time because we're focused on the priorities. This is a farming equipment company. I've redacted some of this, but we came up with a priority model to show the company how we were thinking about our priorities, where we weighted different variables. It didn't do all the thinking for us, but at least it was a way for us to have some debate around, when I look at the plan, what are the priority projects and initiatives that we should be focusing on and monitoring on a regular basis? And then, and this is the heavy lifting that a lot of leadership teams avoid, put names in boxes cross-functionally of who's working on those projects. And every month, ask yourselves, do we have the right people in the right places doing the right things? Because oftentimes we find out projects aren't moving as fast as we want them to in the 11th hour because there was a resource issue that we didn't know about. And teams need to monitor this on a regular basis. It's one of the most important parts of leadership, and it often gets abdicated. And then when it comes to allocating innovation resources, I like this way of thinking about where you're putting your innovation dollars. And I've laid out 3 circles here. What's important to the market? What are we good at? And what's our competition good at? By now you've known that because that's what you use to develop your plan. If it's in there, you want to invest and get better now. If it's here, eliminate, sell, and reallocate resources. If it's here, invest to maintain superiority or spend against the business. If it's here, innovate if the size of the prize justifies it. And then here, invest if the size of the prize is large and we believe we can innovate. And this relates to the organization. Too often I see people develop plans, but then they don't change the organization to actually be able to execute the plan. So I was talking about this earlier. If this is the plan and where we're going, what are the capabilities? Lay them out that we're going to need to be able to execute this plan with fidelity. What is our honest assessment on a scale of 1 to 5? What changes does the team recommend we make? What are the resources needed, and who's the leader? And let's talk briefly about communication. So people talk about people being afraid of change. They really are not. My wife's a psychotherapist. I actually learned this from her. People are afraid of loss. They're afraid of losing things like security, competence, relationships, sense of direction, territory. So when we communicate this plan, some of the people are fired up because they've been involved in it. We've got to take this into consideration. People are not as inclined to change for gain. They are more likely to change to avoid loss. This is a proven fact. It's been done scientifically with coins. They are risk averse in gain and more risk taking in losses. So this presents a bit of a paradox for leaders. And I think this concept I have in front of you right now is one of the most important things about leadership. Whenever I'm screening for leaders, I look for their ability to deal with ambiguity and uncertainty as one of the key things, and obviously lead people. But another thing that I look for is an appreciation for the tension between these two and the balance needed. I learned this at a young age playing sports through college. I was very fortunate playing for some great coaches who were very good at challenging me, but also made me feel like they loved me at the same time. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges of leadership. And that's why I say there is a fine line between a high performance culture and a high anxiety culture, and it's all about balance. So when we're communicating the plan, it's not a one-time event, it's monthly town hall meetings, and we're constantly thinking about this chart. And there are a lot of different ways to communicate, right? We want to make sure we're connecting with customers and partners. I've got a list here for you. One of my favorites is these Delta breakfasts down at the bottom. As a CEO, I used to meet every 2 weeks with a cross section of about 10 people throughout from the company. And we would sit down, I'd buy them bagels, and we would talk about the plan and the execution of the plan and how it's impacting them, and give them a chance to ask questions about how the company's doing. And I came out of that hour every 2 weeks with a long list of learnings. So it's a great way to stay in touch, but also to reinforce the plan and why we're going where we're going. The other thing that's important, this is that last pillar, the cascading accountability, is that we use the plan to get people behaving more accountably and moving up this ladder and thinking about, what can I do? What action can I take? Put the ball in their lap rather than being a victim. So one of the ways we do that is make sure we have a balanced scorecard. We take those metrics from the plan and we create this balanced scorecard that captures a 360-degree view of our business from a customer perspective, from an internal perspective, from a financial perspective, and then what we need to do to be superior in something that matters to the marketplace. Another key part of cascading the plan is taking the OGSM and the S out of there and cascading it functionally down and throughout the organization. And this is just an example. And then each month, I mentioned the leadership team getting together. When they have people coming in and reporting on how things are going, rather than death by a million PowerPoints, I always like having one slide that gives us an update on how that strategy is going and how the leadership team can help the cross-functional team working on it by removing obstacles or helping them with resourcing or whatever it is they need to do to accelerate progress. And then my last slide is a busy one, but I just want to give you an example of how a company, actually we just had this meeting Monday and Tuesday, now is operationalizing the plan. Their plan is developed, it's been communicated. We start with some pre-reading that's been sent out. The leader gives his perspective on how things have gone over the last month. We make sure we're holding ourselves accountable with our results, our scorecard. We review the actions from the last meeting. We talk about the priority and resource dashboard that I showed you earlier. Are there any changes we need to make to that? And then these are the 4 objectives in the strategic plan. They form the agenda. So we are now working the plan with difference makers coming in and meeting with us. Okay, just a couple of examples here. Construction Specialties is a second generation business where the owners were a little dissatisfied with what was happening in the company. The business had stagnated. Family ownership and the board of directors were dissatisfied with the performance of senior management, and trust was beginning to wane between the two. And more importantly, the business units suffered from a lack of strategic directions, and they were really kind of operating independently with no harmonization. We used this process to connect each of the business units under one brand, under one company. And there were some leadership changes that were made as a result of this planning process, and the company is now delivering all-time record sales and profits. This is a company here in Chicago, Medtronics, who is a member of the Loyola Family Business Center, who a few years ago was concerned about coming technological changes. They work in the battery services and management area, and they had an impressive 90% share of the lead acid battery testing market. But we're very concerned about what was happening with EV and technology. We used this process to get really clear about how the company was going to win long-term and leverage its strengths. And I'm happy to say they've completely pivoted and now are going to have more sales in the electric vehicle market than the lead acid battery market. And then finally, this is a farming equipment in Kansas. Roy built this company to $300 million and was 75 and about to retire. And they were having questions about succession. And there was disagreement in the family. The mom wanted to have the oldest son-in-law run the business as Roy left, and Roy wanted his youngest son to run it. And we used this planning process to get clarity around that question. And actually what ended up happening was the youngest son came forward and said, I don't want to run the business. And the company pretty much rejected the oldest son-in-law. So Roy's concern was, geez, I've got this great company. I don't want to sell it because somebody's going to take all the manufacturing to China. And I've got plants throughout Kansas. I feel obligated to these small towns. And because of this planning process, we were able to clarify that Kubota would actually buy the company and agree to not close any of the plants and let them run it independently. He was able to take the money and give it to these towns and some of his employees and become a philanthropist, and it all worked out well for everybody. And then these last two examples, I put up here just because this process can be used for any kind of an organization. Dr. Kathy Banks called me a few years back. She was the dean of the School of Civil Engineering at Purdue, where I attended. And she said, look, I understand you do strategic planning. I'd like for you to join our board. We've fallen out of the top 20 for the first time in the history of the university, and we need to get back. And we developed a plan. It took several years to get there. By the time we made it back to the top 10, Kathy was off to be the dean of engineering at Texas A&M, and they just announced that she's about to become the president of Texas A&M. So this is a really big success story I'm very proud of. And then finally, I've been involved with a domestic violence and human trafficking organization for the last 25 years. And when the 08-09 financial crisis hit, our funding all but dried up. And we were able to use this, because we were using this process, we were able to navigate that storm successfully, and the organization is thriving to this day. So that brings us to the end. We're going to have some breakout questions. And I thought to help you, to give you a little inspiration for the breakout sessions, because there's a little bit in there about change and what's coming, I would list some of the changes that I've seen, certainly not an exhaustive list, but I thought it would be interesting to just share with you some of the changes I've seen before COVID and now. On the left, boards were kept at arm's length, nose in, fingers out. Now boards and management teams working more collaboratively. Before, inventory costs should be minimized using just-in-time methods. Now safety stock is more valued. Almost everyone I'm working with is having supply chain problems. Before, consolidate vendors to minimize complexity. Now ensure safer level of redundancy. Before, business travel is absolutely necessary. Now, sometimes the benefits can be achieved more efficiently. Before, innovation backed by persuasive marketing and selling are the lifeblood of the business. And really, frankly, the supply chain was viewed as something everybody had. It wasn't going to differentiate you. Now, supply chains are not just table stakes. It can be a competitive advantage. I'm oversimplifying here a little bit, but you get the point. Before, diversity and inclusion as an optional strategy. Now, diversity, equity, inclusion is high on the leadership agenda for most. Before, more women advancing and positively impacting leadership capabilities. Now, women in general were much more negatively impacted by the pandemic. There's plenty of data on that. Before, digital transformation as needed. Now, digital transformation accelerated. Before, ESG as a niche investment strategy. Now there's significant funds flowing toward ESG. Before, most work is best done in person. Now, remote work can be productive and efficient, although I would say I've seen a huge negative impact on culture. So there's an element of balance that's going to be required there as we go back to some different state. And then e-commerce growing fast. There's some good data that came out yesterday that, depending on which country you look at, but Europe and the US had the most acceleration of digital commerce that we've seen around the globe. So I thought those might be some good thought starters for your breakout session.
Jude, this was awesome. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I just know that there are a couple of people in the audience. We're teed up to move into breakouts just around 10 o'clock, but I really wanted to offer people an opportunity to ask you direct questions. I had one question during your presentation. Brendan Wall would like you to tell us a little bit more about the difference in the strategic planning processes that yield more market disruptive outcomes versus the incremental growth path.
I think the biggest difference would be the companies that get to the disruption have a couple things going for them. One, they're more connected to the market in general. They spend more time there, they're more immersed there, they're obsessed with it, right? Number one. Number two, they work better with the outside. Some family-owned companies can tend to be very insular, and I find that those, and in fact, I'm working with one right now that we've introduced them to some external help, and it's really changing their culture a lot, and it's helping them attract new talent, and it's opening their eyes. So I think anything you can do to open people's eyes to a broader way of thinking about the business would be, at the top of the list.
Thank you. I cannot see everybody on the call, so if someone has a specific, just unmute yourself and speak up.
Jude, this is Dennis Kessler. Thank you. Terrific presentation as usual. Question, do you modify the process in some way depending on the size of the business? Some of our businesses are less than 50 million and some are 700-800 million.
Absolutely. I didn't point this out. I'm glad you asked that question. I actually first developed this process while working in a big company running their largest division. And it has changed a lot since then because I went off to use it to turn around smaller companies that were either private equity backed or family owned. And we really, not just me, but my teams simplified it a lot. So the answer is yes. It's not a cookie cutter thing. I mean, I just gave you a high level view, but if you look down under the covers, it's very different for every company we do this with. I mean, we've done it with I'm working with a startup right now and then working with a $2 billion company. Very, very different. But a lot of the principles remain.
Here's another one. How do you square the very time-consuming 6-month process you're describing with Herb Kelleher's approach of just doing things? This is an approach about getting culture right and results will follow.
Great question. We actually turn away 2 out of every 3 requests for proposals because people can't see past this part. And we only work with servant leaders who really take their role of serving the people they're leading seriously, because it is an investment. However, it actually ends up saving time. Because as we get in the beginning, it's a bit of an investment organizing the sub-teams and things like that. But one of the reasons why we space it out so long is we believe it needs to percolate, and that helps us not make it such a time crunch. And people are really doing this work more in line with the day-to-day running of the business. And those two start to dovetail pretty quickly over the first 6 months. And usually what happens is some things come up inevitably, like an acquisition or selling a poor performing division, or frankly, outplacing a toxic leader. These things start to bubble up in these work sessions, and it becomes quite clear, hey, wait, we don't have to wait till we get this plan developed. And I'll point it out. You guys all, because I do one-on-ones with each one of them in between work sessions, and they start telling me all these things. So I lay it on the table because I can. And I stoke that constructive contention, and that usually leads to execution well before we're at the point where we're communicating the strategic plan. So it actually ends up being efficient. And like I said, so much happens in those daily work sessions that people start using that as a bucket, and they don't set up meetings so much because they say, well, I can just wait and we can do that in our monthly strategy session.
Very good. Are you saying there is an internal cultural change that this immersive process delivers that is one of the primary long-term benefits? Sure.
There are 3 byproducts that I love. I always say I get called to help with strategic planning, but what we really help with is leadership development, high performance teaming, and cultural transformation.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to jump in because I have I have access to the brain trust here. Yesterday, I was on a call with a company that has just been in war room mentality for the last, and literally they have different teams that are war room focused. And I did ask, I said, what is your future going forward? And she mentioned a few things that they were going to be doing. But this is a cultural shift from emergency to let's take a deep breath and how do we go forward? Do you have any advice for people about acknowledging what happened, celebrating some of the great wins, and then how do we go forward? How do you get people to adjust and calm down and start to focus?
Yeah, well, that's a tough one because I don't know the specifics of the situation, because so much of this is about what's working, being honest about what's working, what's not working, and what are we going to do to course correct. So it to some extent it depends on what their situation is. I'm often amazed when we're debating what we're going to say or what we're going to do about something as a team with teams, where we'll come up with it and I'll point out, hey, by the way, what we just came up with is the truth. And I think too often people are so worried about how people are going to perceive something that they're too worried about spinning it or how we're going to position it. And a lot of times, you certainly have to consider those things, but focusing on being as transparent as you possibly can ends up usually being the most efficient.
Thank you. Dennis Rumer wants to know, are there any differences in strategic planning which public companies undertake versus what family businesses undertake?
Yeah, I would say I've only really done this
I think Jude's internet is, I think you were unstable for a minute there. So can you repeat that?
Okay. I've only done this with one public company in the last 7 years. Before I did it, within public companies, I would say the biggest difference I've seen is it tends to be more financially oriented, a little bit more focused on scenario planning and things like that, and a little bit less focused on culture and core values and purpose and things that frankly, it's one of the reasons why I tend to work with family-owned companies, because I think there's a greater appreciation for the importance of those things.
And then go quick to market, right? With whatever changes they make.
Yeah.
Anybody have questions for Jude? Jump in.
Hey, Jude. I've got a question related to the development of the team. So you mentioned the team, the subgroups. How do you balance, wanting to have a variety of perspectives, a lot of people on the team, but without giving everybody in the company a seat at the table. So can you, elaborate on, how you pick from, how you put the team together and make it so you don't have, 20, 50 people, in the strategic planning sessions, or maybe that's the right number. Yeah.
No, that's too many. I do have a client who has 19 around the world, and it's one of the benefits of Zoom, by the way, is all the international people now are much more participative. So now the problem is we have to do the meeting from like 7 a.m., or 7 p.m. to 11 p.m. But it's too many. So a lot of times it's really up to the leader. It's not, I don't decide, I advise. And it's a lot better when the leader has 8 to 10 direct reports and it's clearly defined who that core team is going to be. And what I do is go around in my one-on-ones and ask each person, who are the real difference makers around here? And I keep a list. Of course, HR has a list too, but I find my list sometimes is different than the HR list. And I make damn sure that everyone on that list touches this process at some point along the way. But your question is a tougher one. Like I said, I think a core team of anywhere from 6 to 12 is good. When you've got 19 or 20 people, you got too many people hanging back. And it's harder, frankly, for me to stoke constructive contention, because keep in mind, I'm getting the insight in the one-on-ones, and then I'm not giving away any confidences in the work sessions, but I know when to lob something into the middle of the room that's going to blow up that we really need to argue about. That's a lot easier to do with 8 people than it is with 19.
And then can you elaborate a little more too on the levels that you would bring into the multiple levels or only senior leadership? So it's both the number of people, but then what bands?
Yeah. So core team, leadership team, or some people call it executive committee. I hate that term, but basically the leadership team, the CEO or president's direct reports, that kind of group is the core strategic team. You might have somebody that's operating at a quote unquote VP level, but they're really considered on that team. But to get to your other part of the question, the difference maker list, I don't care about level. I want difference makers because they're the people that people are going to follow. I want the people who get shit done in your company, and that everybody knows, you remember the old innovation curve, right? It's the innovators, the early adopters, and I think it's the laggards or whatever. I want those people, that the people who are waiting to see if they get their head chopped off or not, then they'll follow them. Those are the people I want.
And you want the people.
That could be somebody in the warehouse.
And Jude, how do you work with them? Like, where do they show up? At what level of the process do the difference makers show up? Is that just you interviewing them?
No, I try to interview them. Sometimes I do. Sometimes there's too many. Depends on the size of the company. The core team leads them. And that's the beauty, is they take what I teach. See, what I love about this process, and this is how I sell it, I'm teaching your team how to do this in perpetuity. I have people who worked with me that went on to lead another company who are using the process now to run their company. It's not a one and done thing. It's actually something you can integrate into running the company.
Joe Zatkoff, did I cut you off? Did you have a follow-up question?
No, that was addressed. Thank you very much.
Okay. Here's another call. Have you used this process, or question? Have you used this process with holding companies across related businesses in different market segments? How does it differ, and how well can it work?
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer is yes. But most of the time it was because the owner wanted to try to harmonize them or somehow capitalize on some synergies. It gets harder when they're completely different. The ownership or the shareholders need to want a strategy for the whole enterprise. That's what I've been talking about. However, this can be used for one piece or one business within that enterprise. Just like I used it and home cleaning at SC Johnson. So sometimes we'll do it for the whole enterprise. And then as part of the cascading, those separate pieces will then go do the same thing and make sure it's connected to what was done for the enterprise.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Jude, a question for you. I love what you say about getting the difference makers involved. And then sometimes working with clients, I've been able, when I can, to pull in a next generation family business owner as kind of the secretary or some way to sneak them in as a learning exercise. Love to hear your opinion about that.
Yeah, we do that quite a bit, actually. I mean, I have clients who's, the owner's, the CEO, and their son is 28, and they want to make sure they're somehow connected more so to this process, but not overly favored. So there's varying levels. I mean, I may include them on my one-on-one list each month. It really kind of depends on what. This kind of relates back to your other question about cookie cutterness. It really depends on the goals of the owner or the CEO and what they want. But there are different ways to include them, either as an observer or in the sub-teams.
Thanks, Jude. Here's a great question. Oh, I'm sorry. Dennis, did you have a follow-up?
No.
Okay. From Ann Wall, how do you build creativity and risk-taking into this wonderfully highly structured and analytical linear process?
Yeah, that's why I like that strategy canvas part of this, even though really nothing comes out of that. There's no output that, gets publicized from that. But within the, I kind of glossed over that, but that piece around challenging conventional wisdom, that's a key part of this. Because my goal in that part is to scare the hell out of the leadership team. Like with Medtronics, we brought in a video about the future of power from MIT. And even though they all have patents and they're brilliant PhDs, they're so busy, doing the day-to-day work. They needed somebody from the outside to go, hey guys, guess what? The world's going to change really fast. And we're going to get caught flat-footed if we're not careful. And they've done an amazing job of pivoting.
Will you talk a little bit more about the constructive tension that's part of this process? Because, it also could turn into infighting and territorialism and all of that. How do you balance that?
It's kind of an art, to be honest with you. It's a tough question to answer. I actually really like it. And I think because I was a CEO for 11 years, and I felt like I needed more of it from my teams. I mean, we always talked about it on my teams. I always said, guys, we need to debate. Now, we're going to get to the old 80-20 rule, right? Like, okay, I've heard enough. Now I'm the decider. Here's what we're going to do. And we're going to lock arms and we're going to walk out of here completely aligned. And I don't want to hear any dissension. So there's a place for it. And then there's a time for alignment, right? That's actually hard for me as an advisor because I got to I can't put that CEO hat on. I've got to let my CEO have that hat. So the big part for me is coaching the leader on when to, or the owner, it's even harder in some cases because they're used to being the Herb Kelleher, right? They're used to telling everybody what to do. And I have to sometimes in the one-on-ones go, you really need to hang back a little bit and let them fight. And so there's a little bit of an art to that of building the capability to know when enough arguing and debating is enough, and when we need to just get aligned and go forward. I know I'm not answering your question very much, but it's a hard one to answer.
It depends. The answer is it depends.
It really does. Every situation's different.
So we have a few more minutes before we go to the breakout room, and I just want to pick your brain about this too, which is, again, execution strategy and execution right now going forward. There's so much ambiguity, more ambiguity maybe than anyone has ever experienced in their professional lives. How does this process work when we have to be still nimble, still fast? I mean, how can we afford to take the time to do this?
Well, I think how can you not? I mean, I had two clients who called me on March 13th last year and said, we're going to pause. either for financial, one late furloughed 70% of their people. I understood that, right? But they were back in 2 months later because we had built a rhythm of getting together. And so what happens is people stop communicating, unfortunately, in times of ambiguity. There's plenty of data on this right now, even this whole thing about how we're going to go back to work. There are a lot of people on the front lines feeling very stressed out about that. And we really don't have great answers for them. But that doesn't mean we stop communicating. So this mechanism was a way for the team to at least feel like, okay, we're staying connected. We don't know all the answers, but we're still coming together, gnashing teeth. And we've got a process to keep us, again, direction, alignment, commitment.
Yeah.
And if everybody scatters, especially in a remote world, I mean, it's bad enough in the office when people stay in the corner. Look, the reality is some leaders work really hard to get to that position, and they really do just want to stay in the corner office. They really like the trappings of being the CEO or the president or whatever. They really don't want to walk out in the warehouse. Yeah. They really don't want to lead their people. Those are the people I don't want to work with. We won't work well together.
Okay, we've got one more question before we, or actually two more questions, thank you, before we go to break. One from Megan Roundy: how do you keep the momentum going on strategic planning process and continually measure it versus going back to an annual process that sits on the shelf as more of a check the box mentality?
Yeah, I do still think there's a place for that. I probably was too hard on that. I do still think, even though we're working at dynamic,
one moment. I think you just pause just a minute. You had a little freeze.
I do think there's still a place for periodic reassessment.
Okay.
I mean, even though it's happening dynamically, I didn't mean to infer that you don't step back sometimes and say, we need to do a deeper dive. Instead of just executing, step back again and say, let's cast a broad net and see what we might be missing. So I still think there's a place for the annual part of it. I just don't think it should be, okay, we did that, now let's go back and, really run the business.
So more of a review than a reset, Jude.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, good question. Yeah.
Okay, and then I think one final question here, and this is again, probably somebody who is clearly able to see the forest for the trees. Can you talk more about the intrinsic motivation generated by having a clearly articulated higher purpose to shoot for in business, and why this is important for differentiating mission-driven businesses?
Yeah, so, my kids are in their 30s now, and they were raised very differently than I was, somewhat for socioeconomic reasons, but also generational reasons. I was ready to bust my ass, work hard, and good things will happen to you, right? I didn't ask much about what, I worked on nuclear power plants and all kinds of stuff. I wasn't really that concerned about what the missions were or purpose or any of that stuff. We got more women in the workplace in management, and we got millennials who care about meaning and purpose in their life. If you can't paint a picture of why what they're doing matters for society, that's a problem. So the leadership bar for leaders has been raised. We can't just get together and put the financials up anymore, right? When I was running an education company, we brought in teachers, we brought in people, we had videos of kids and things that, our former owner thought, well, we just make these things and, who cares about that stuff? Just make the money. And no, our people wanted to know they were doing something of value for society. And I think that bar has been raised.
And probably still some people struggle with it, right?
Oh, yeah. And hey, developing that purpose statement is one of the hardest things in this process.
Okay. Thank you. All right. We have, we're going to take about 10 minutes to actually go to breakout rooms. And what that means is for all of you, go take a bio break, get your water, coffee, whatever. When you come back, you might have to accept that you're moving into the breakout room, but I'm going to move you there now. You will have a facilitator in your rooms. In room 1, we have Anna Purton. In room 2, we have Bryn Reamer. In room 3, we have Johnny Cooley. And in room 4, the wonderful Andrew Kite, who's joining us today. So lucky number 4. Jude will also be joining us in one of the rooms, and I'm going to kind of bop in and out of the rooms. when we get close to the 1 hour mark, or maybe the 45-minute mark, I'm going to check in and see how you all are doing with the questions, the facilitated questions, and then we will close out, and I'll let you know about that, and we'll come back together. Right now, I just want to give a big round of applause to Jude, because this was really great meat for us to digest, and now let's get our brain trust together, okay? Thank you, Jude, and I will see you all in your breakout sessions.